Hello and welcome to the Lunar Poetry Podcast. My name's Paul McMenemy. Unfortunately, your usual host, David Turner, is unable to perform that duty today because he's one of the guests, along with Tom Bland and Jason Pilley. All three are well known on the London spoken word scene for their distinctive styles. Today we're going to be talking about performance. Gentlemen, can I ask you to introduce yourselves, please?
I'll go first. So my name is David Turner, regular Lunar Poetry podcaster and reviewer. I am also a failed visual artist and occasional poet and short story writer. Outside of this almost imaginary world of poetry, I work in a bronze foundry in Limehouse in East London, which is actually relevant to my background, which is art technician. I also co-host a spoken word evening with Lizzie Palmer called Silence Found a Tongue, which is also the launch event for each Lunar Poetry Magazine issue. And these nights take place at Eclectic Gallery in Waterloo, and they're on the second Monday of every month.
Right, my name's Jason, and I do a bunch of things. At a CV level, I'm a carer, which sounds great, doesn't it? I care. The government pays me to care.
You are very caring.
I'm a very caring person. And that's just my sort of secret identity. That's the Clark Kent, that's the cover story. Behind that, my real work is I write this endless sequence of unpublishable, unreadable novels. And I'm also an occasional youth worker, which sort of keeps me, engaged in the community, keeps me on my toes. And a few years back, on top of all that, I wrote some poems by mistake. And these poems are really insistent. Normally when you write something, it's ink on paper, you put it aside, write the next thing. But these poems really wanted to be spoken, they wanted to be recited. So I felt compelled to go to a poetry night, which I generally resented the idea of. I had real preconceptions about what poetry would be, what poetry audiences would be. And I was completely wrong. It was a real revelation. So that was 4 years ago. And since then I've just been doing constant poetry. My life is poetry now, when I'm not caring.
So I'm Tom, and I guess I'm a poet, a reluctant one and an accidental one. I started writing about when I was 15 and then gave it up for a number of years and then went to Poetry Unplugged. Back in the days when Niall was really drunk when he used to host, which is no longer the case. And I think it was this drunken atmosphere that I found a kind of home and started to write and started to take it a bit more seriously. And then for the last 4 years or so I've been studying at the poetry school and running numerous nights.
Right, great, thanks. Okay, so as I said, y'all have fairly unusual performance styles, as we'll hear later. I was wondering how you came to your manner of delivery.
I can begin again. Mine was completely by accident. I mean, I'm the most recent to performance poetry out of the three of us. I started, my first reading was May the 3rd, 2014, so it's like 6 months or so. And I really didn't know what I wanted to do other than to read a poem in front of people, and I shit myself so much that I almost couldn't finish the first poem. I don't remember the second poem I read, and then the second reading that I did, I went into like a defense mode, and I became almost unbearably aggressive, and and physically attacked the audience. But I went at them certainly, and I've toned it down a lot since then, but so it wasn't really so much, at the beginning it wasn't a conscious decision. I wasn't thinking about performance styles. I was just thinking, how the fuck do I get through this poem without cracking up? Because obviously, quite often, I think a lot of us start by writing quite emotional poems, because that's where a lot of these feelings are coming from. And then to read them to a room of strangers is pretty terrifying. So that's sort of how it came about first. I think then it developed into actually thinking, well, why am I being defensive or aggressive? And actually I found the best way to be defensive was to sort of try and take on a character. I don't know how Jason and Tom feel about that aspect, about assuming a character while you're performing, which I definitely do. It's very rarely me that's on stage in that sense. But at the same time, it's not acting. But maybe we can get into that later. But
the old Stuart Lee defence?
I probably would quote Stuart Lee on every one of these answers if possible, because I do agree with a lot that he says. But yeah, I mean, I take a lot of my influence from stand-up comedy, in that you can play yourself, but just an exaggerated version, and it sort of gives you a bit of a shield from criticism. And I'm happy to admit that it's just through fear of criticism that you develop that shield in the first place, but it can be quite useful as well, you know.
Yeah, so as I said, I've written some poems that I felt obligated to perform. I went along to what I was told, had an open mic section. I had them written down on some paper. I was going to read out these words. I thought that'd be it, and I could never have to think about poetry again. I went there wasn't an open mic section, so I just had to sit and listen, and it was an amazing experience. I was really blown away by the quality, the intensity, and I felt like I really knew that that's something I wanted to do more of, and I wanted to take it seriously. So it was a matter of memorising these poems, treating it as you would a song or an acting thing, and just have it in your head rather than reading off paper. So then there's this process of doing that, of reading them, getting them in your head. And then one day, the paper was down, my hands were by my side, and I was reading out these poems, my hands were by my side, I was standing still, and it's just completely unnatural. So I was like, okay, what are my hands actually doing? What are my legs doing? What am I head doing? So I sort of, it just felt natural.
For the benefit of the listening audience, Jason is flailing his hands.
Yes, I think my performance style, you talk about having a persona on stage.
Yeah.
I sort of exaggerate myself.
Yeah.
I'm not myself I am myself on stage, but I'm more myself. I'm more frenetic.
It's an exaggeration.
It's not a character as such.
Actually, the point you just made is actually something that I forgot to mention there. Is one thing that I found very useful was in my second reading. As a defence mechanism, I picked up the microphone and faced the back wall, and I did the whole poem, and I didn't look at the audience once. And when I came off, someone said to me, "I really like your performance style." How long have you been doing that for? And I was 3.5 minutes. But I found I'm probably similar to Jason here. I feel too restricted almost to read if I don't move, and I think that's where we have a lot of similarities. We both move around a lot, but in different ways. But I can't stand still and stand at the mic. I hate.
No, I think for me, poetry and performance poetry are the same thing. It is a performance. You're getting out there. It isn't just the word. It isn't just the sound of the words. These are very important things. I love the process of poetry from the beginning, from that spark of inspiration through the crafting the poem, through the memorising it. But it's about being there, being watched, and being moving, being related to it at every level, at a physical level. So that's my performance style. It just comes natural, really. It isn't natural just to stand there. Blah, 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 blah. It's much more natural.
I think my performance style has kind of changed as much as my poetry has over the years. So to begin with, I moved around a lot, particularly my hands, and I would overemphasize words as well a lot. And I've come to care less and less about performance, and more to do with what poems I'm reading and what the structure of those poems are. And I like the poems to kind of interrelate with each other. So images will kind of reoccur between poems to create the kind of idea of a narrative is taking place. Even if that narrative isn't that clear in terms of a kind of beginning, middle and an end. I prefer circles to lines.
That's an interesting point, actually. So how do you go about putting a set together? Because obviously that's a sort of different thing than just having a poem.
But I can begin, because my answer is quite short, and I haven't worked out how to do that yet. I think I'm terrible at putting sets together, but it's mainly because what I write, just about everything that I would be interested in performing in front of an audience, nearly every piece needs to come at the beginning of the set, because a lot of what I do is based around the fact that people don't really know what's happening at the beginning. I'm either facing away, or I seem to be falling apart in front of people. You can't do one of those poems and then do a second one straight afterwards, because it just seems a bit ridiculous. Because once you take away that element of surprise or confusion, it sort of loses its meaning anyway. Yeah, so I struggle personally with... One thing I will say is that I do admire people when they put a set together properly, because it makes... You can really tell they've put a lot of thought into it. But at the same time, I find it very odd when people have got a set so worked out, they've even got the links in between. It's all scripted. I find that very, very odd.
You've got sort of pattern.
Yeah, it's a strange thing to watch. I'm not saying it's necessarily a bad thing, but it is odd. I think because it's just the opposite of how I work. It just seems...
For me, it takes it too much into theatre.
Yes, I think that's the problem, isn't it? Yeah.
I don't really see a problem with going too far into theatre, personally. But in terms of putting a set together, I think there are different ways to approach that. One is just to think of the audience, and there are places where certain poems you just know aren't going to be appreciated, and somewhere there's a certain mood where you want to establish. We go the other way. One thing I like to do is just write down all the names of my poems on bits of cardboard or paper, and just put them in a hat, and just okay, my next poem is going to be this one, and just completely randomise the set.
But then it isn't random, is it? Like, I know it's chance which one comes out, but the set isn't random. The set's a conceived idea, isn't it? Like that you're going to pull things out of a bag. Like you've designed the set. You don't know what's happening in the set, but you have designed.
If you've got
like 2
hours of poems, but you only got a 10-minute set, then it's completely.
No. I don't mean it's not random which poems come out, but you have planned what's going to happen for the whole time you're on stage. You've planned that whole set out, haven't you? Or is that not?
I don't think so, because there are many more poems that you could be doing that you won't be doing, and therefore it's. I don't think it is planned.
Okay.
There's, you're not making it up as you go along. There's some sort of planning in there, but it's the order, the specific poems. That's completely open.
But I think this idea is quite interesting. This idea of improvisation and different levels of improvisation, and how you can have a certain amount of planning but improvise within a framework. And that's what I mean. You're improvising within quite a strict framework, and that framework may only be that you're on stage for 10 minutes, right? And that you say hello. I've got a bag full of poems in. Right, but it is a framework, and then you have to end and say goodbye, even if goodbye is stopping and just walking off.
Isn't that true for all improvisation, though? That actually what is done in improvisation is that you develop a structure. So the structure of what you're saying is that you have the bag with the poems in, but you don't know what poems are going to come out when, which kind of surprises you as much as it surprises the audience, which creates a kind of genuine response between the two of you. And I think that's really kind of interesting. And I can't do the same set twice. Yeah. I can't, I'll arrange a series of poems, and maybe I've got 2 gigs one night and then the day after. If I do the same set twice, it's kind of like I'm trying to relive the one that happened earlier, and that for me never ever works. That I have to have, there has to be a certain element of spontaneity in it, and I think it's less so than you, Jason. But in the order of the poems, in changing the orders around and in introducing a different poem and taking one out, then the way I structure the set gives voice to new ideas that I hadn't kind of previously thought of or hadn't previously developed. And that's kind of what I'm aiming for. And I think the more I kind of do it, the less kind of obviously spontaneous it is. That now I don't really think about, I need to say something funny here, or I need to be, do something a little spontaneous here. I don't kind of have those thoughts anymore, because they're kind of distracting me from actually reading the poems, and then kind of just working out what's the next bit. So then a thought will pop into my head, and I think, oh yeah, that's what I should say here. And I think that is what makes a poetry reading interesting, both for the poet and for the audience, is when those flashes come out of seemingly nowhere, but is somehow embodied in the material you're working with. This poem is called Our Death. Our Death. Night rain taps harshly against the house, windows stream. You smile with white teeth, mine golden. You're like an angel, green eyes, pale cheeks, ginger curls. I paint your picture with a glance. Your fingers pull away each layer of my skin to know the ether of the bone. My hands claw into your body to see bitter, bright galaxies. It's still raining. Our death. Teeth glitter in the empty space.
So you're saying you improvise within your poems? You've got a basic poem worked out, but you improvise within that, like you do, David?
Yeah, I was just about to say that actually, because I agree. I don't like doing the same thing twice. I mean, I would like to have enough time to write enough new poetry to just do a poem and then never revisit it. You know? But what I've started to do is a compromise I've found is that I now have started to not write things down, so that I either A, forget parts of it when I'm on stage, or B, don't worry too much if I want to add something into it. And if should something happen on the night, you can emphasise it. Like I've got a couple of there was a piece I did a couple of months ago at Spoken Word London, and I thought it was quite sad, quite emotional. And then I did a couple of bits. There's a couple of lines in there, and people started to laugh. And I was like, if that had been a written down fixed poem, I probably would have thrown the poem away. I wouldn't have rewritten it. But I was then able to just leave those lines out the next time I did it, and I could improvise something else within it. But I mean, I'm much less concerned now with having a fixed set of lines of writing.
I stick to what I've written when I'm reading the poem.
Yes, yeah.
And I never learn poems anymore, just because I don't have the memory for it. You know, I just can't physically do it and anymore. And I think that's a good thing actually, because I'm probably gonna kind of disagree with you two on this, but for me, poetry is a kind of written art form, and actually holding a piece of paper, kind of telling the audience that actually I've spent time on this, I've worked on this, I've edited this.
I mean, that's crazy. I mean, if you've memorised something, then that conveys the exact same information.
Doesn't
crazy is a bit strong.
I think I'd hover somewhere in between those two opinions, because I really love this whole. If you could, I suppose, what we're talking about now, say there's poetry and there's spoken word. I don't think that's bollocks, but I mean, you could say that, but that sort of seems where the division is between those two opinions. But I have things that exist that I will do on stage, and I have some of them written down, but I also have poems which I won't read out because I don't want to read from the paper, and I don't think I could. I don't want to be worried about saying them word for word. There are certain things that I write that I believe they have to be perfect word for word, and I don't think I want to try and remember that, because I mess things up too much. Or I don't. When I'm on stage, I give up caring about that sort of thing. But afterwards, I think, oh shit, I've messed that up, or you know. So I think I have written poetry, so I have that side of things. But also, I think you can have both.
There are kind of poets who do memorise things, such as Jason, and Mark Waldron always remembers his poetry when he performs it. Although it's interesting that he wouldn't class himself as a performance poet. And I said to him, well, isn't the definition of a performance poet someone who remembers their poetry? Isn't that's the only kind of real difference I've ever actually seen.
How old is he?
I don't know. He's in his
40s.
Something like that.
Yeah, that's why he hates the term.
Yeah.
Because we've spoken about this, Paul and I, about the idea of the phrase performance poet to those that were involved with poetry in the 90s. It became like there are a lot of people that believe the performance poetry thing nearly destroyed what was happening in the open mic, because it just became a lot of actors coming down and not really caring about the writing. And I think there are certain people who believe that if you claim you're a performance poet, it means you don't really care about the writing, which is. But I think for us, I don't think either of us believe that. You know?
I don't think that's true anymore. I think.
But apparently, the appropriate term is spoken word artist, which
just
sounds awful.
Yeah. Well, the problem with spoken word is it doesn't really say anything, and I mean, who are you classifying as a spoken word artist as well? It doesn't. I don't think actually. I would, if I would actually differentiate spoken word from poetry. I think they are kind of two separate things, which is, and both of them have their own rules and their own way of crafting and their own way of working. I think there are a few poets who kind of blurring that, Kate Tempest being the obvious example. But Dean Atter as well. He would be another example. Actually, I'm just contradicting myself. Actually, no, they're actually exactly the same thing.
Finally, we move on.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you're saying that the definition of performance poet would be someone who memorises, but I mean, surely anyone who gets up on stage and reads is performing. I mean, you do consider yourself to be performing, do you?
I think less and less so. I think I'm more interested in just standing up and reading the poems now. I think a part of that is that my influences have changed recently as well. And I'm doing different kind of gigs where they actually want to hear the poetry rather than me mumbling on about something. I think the whole problem with performance in poetry is that I think the generally conceived view is you either emphasize the performance or you emphasize the poetry. And if you're a poet reading, the poetry is the important bit. That's what's been crafted, and the performance is a kind of thing you're kind of just having to do to sell books or something. Where the reverse is true with a performance poet, that the performance is what is important, and the poetry is just kind of what you have to do to get the gig. And I don't think that's true, and I think if you just kind of ignore both of those things, if you just take both of them away and just say, actually, it's a guy standing there speaking. Now, is what he's doing by doing that interesting? And I think, David, that's the kind of weird thing you play with as well. You know, are you just some guy standing up there speaking to us?
Yeah, I mean,
sometimes, you know, and it seems like you're speaking more to yourself than it does to us, which actually I love, and I think that's a really interesting thing to do as well.
I think it's probably something we're going to come on to later, but I think that came out of like a sort of defensive thing as well. I thought, well, if I just tell this story to myself, then it doesn't, you know, they're not really there. But of course they are, and then you come back to that, then it can sound quite pretentious, you know, because you know they're there, and pretending they're not is a bit ridiculous. But just a quick point about what you were saying earlier, just now, I think people should be allowed to get up and recite their poetry and not have people claiming they're performing. Because some people don't want to perform. Some people do just want to get up and recite poetry. And there is a difference between, even though you might be doing the same thing by standing at a microphone and reading a poem, I think there's a vital difference in letting people just go up. Because I think some people, the danger is, I mean, most of us here are big fans of like, the more interesting the performance, the better. But I don't think it's fair that certain people feel that they're judged by audiences in their lack of performance ability. Do you know what I mean? Which is the danger of this kind of discussion, because you're making the performance side of it seem more important than it maybe is.
Well, the counterpoint to that is that, you know, you are in front of an audience, and the audience is there for a reason.
Yeah, to wait for their 5 minutes of open mic.
at some nights, yeah. But not in all cases.
No,
sometimes they're reviewing it for Lunar Poetry.
Yeah, so watch out. See my orange book at the back of the room. In trouble.
But yeah, so the audience is there, and presumably, you know, the audience is there, and presumably you do want them to have a good time.
Is that my responsibility though? I'm not so sure it is. I'm not. See, I think this is where the whole phrase "the audience is irrelevant" kind of came out of, and it's not that they aren't relevant, but it was more of a kind of response to certain poets who want to stand up and please the audience for their applause, and I don't think that makes interesting poetry, nor does it make an interesting performance. The what if Shakespeare had done that? Hamlet would have been, no one would have died, everyone would have gone home happy, and
we wouldn't have the Lion King.
Yeah, and we wouldn't have the Lion King, which is much better than Hamlet.
Well, yeah, but on the other hand, Shakespeare did plenty of plays where that basically is what happens. The comedies, are comedies.
Yeah, but are they ever performed? What's performed? Yeah. Romeo and Juliet, Hamlet. The ones with the death at the end are the ones that are performed.
Yeah.
But I think the kind of issue that if you're doing that, what makes it different from just watching a soap opera or a comedy on TV? I mean, I think poetry needs to be a bit more challenging, and
sorry, that was sort of the point I was trying to make about people feeling like they have to perform, right? If you say to people you can just recite, because this is a firm opinion of mine, which a lot of people might disagree with, but as soon as you tell people that they're expected to perform, most people will try and please the audience. And then I think when people feel they have to perform, then they get into this habit of trying to, they choose, their writing style changes, their performance style changes, and then you end up with this really dull succession of crap, and it is, and it's not because they have a lack of writing ability or a lack of performance ability as such. It's just most people will feel, well, if I have to perform, then people should be smiling, they should be laughing, they should be clapping, which is what I think us three feel strongly. Why? Why should they be smiling and clapping?
But is there that conception? I mean, people, most open mic nights seem to just be, you've got your 3 minutes, your 5 minutes, there's a microphone. If you want to stand there with a piece of paper, do that. If you want to prance about, do that. Is there any pressure to perform? I mean, it might be.
I think so, because it's perhaps not in the poetry, it's the jokes in between. You can see how people feel, you can see people trying to ingratiate themselves with audiences, and it's the asides, it's not always the poetry. The poetry is as depressing as everyone else's poetry, but there are a lot of one thing that we certainly don't do is Tom makes some jokes, but they're clearly unfunny, so it's fine. But you do. You must have seen it yourself. There are a lot of people that stand up and they're sort of. It's not just because they're involved in poetry. Most people that stand up in front of groups of people will make jokes because they don't want people to look at them mortified.
I used to do a thing where I would tell a joke that was deliberately unfunny and say, "Well, I'm not a comedian. I'm not here to make you laugh." So the fact that joke didn't make you laugh is the only response I wanted from you.
Actually, one of my earliest memories from starting, it's not that long ago, but I think when I came to when you were still doing Unmade Bed, and I think that was the first time I saw you host, and you used to say that line all the time, if anyone tried to join in with your asides, because you used to do asides towards the audience, but if anyone dared answer, you were like, this is not for you, this is not for you, this bit's not for you, and I quite like that, it's this, you may as well, it's nice to give the impression that everyone could leave and it would still carry on. Of course it wouldn't, but it's nice to give that impression.
Well, that's my dream really, is just to perform to an empty room. That's actually what I want. But only because I know I would perform better then, because I wouldn't have the anxiety of the audience. And I think that's what makes standing up in front of people interesting, is that it kind of induces a kind of mini trance in my being. And then other stuff will start to happen. So someone might shout something out from the audience, or I might be reading a poem and a thought suddenly flashes into my mind, or I start to realise a link between a poem, which then I can start to play with. with the audience. The audience are there as a kind of, they're the people I'm playing with. They're kind of like the other children in the playground. And that for that 5 minutes or whatever it is, the attention is focused on me, but my attention is focused on them.
Yeah.
And it's that dynamic that makes it interesting.
Yeah.
So you are, to some extent, still looking for a reaction from the audience. I mean, one thing I was thinking when you were talking about using humour is one thing that's often difficult with poetry is gauging the reaction of the audience. If they're laughing, then you know that they're responding to what you're saying. If you're doing a serious poem, you've not really got any idea whether it's gone across well or not, because obviously people clap politely at the end, whatever. But yeah, so talking about audience participation, I mean, is this something to be encouraged?
No.
Well, I was thinking because in a lot of your readings, you do seem to invite it. Partly the way you present your work and the sort of pauses and the kind of little preamble to the, whether you consciously invite it or not, it often seems to happen.
I think I actually like reactions from the audience, and I do deliberately provoke the audience in certain moments. And I think one of the influences that's already been mentioned is Stuart Lee, and kind of in his book, which name I have forgotten now, he talks about dividing the audience up into different sections. Those who get what's happening, those who are unsure, and those who couldn't care less and thinking about sheep or whatever. And I think that is kind of true at a poetry reading as well. And I think he does that to kind of actually bring the audience together for the punchline. You know that he's stirring you all up to actually kind of hate him or to like him, or not to know whether you like him or hate him, which then makes him vulnerable, and that it can give you that unexpected line. And I think that's an interesting thing to do in poetry. But I don't think I think about things like that anymore. I wouldn't deliberately try to provoke the audience in the way I would have done a year ago.
Yeah.
I think I much prefer the poem to do the work. And whether the audience gets it or not, well, I wouldn't know how to judge that. I mean, if they laugh or clap or whatever, that's an interesting response, but it doesn't kind of actually uncover anything that's going on beneath the surface. And I find that more interesting, and that'll play out in different ways, usually more after the reading than during it. And I think that's and the job of the performer is just to hold that, even if they don't know what's really there to hold.
Right, this is called Words for Catherine by Jason Pilley. An actual love riot breaks out. Charity gangs throw hard cash up and down the mobbed streets. Cackling balaclavaed grannies push each other in shopping trolleys past the flames. London burns with mad passions. New angel terrorists attack the florists with flowers. Attack the banks and coffee buzz shops with flowers. Attack and the police bring tea and lovely biscuits. It's all getting too wildly nice for me. You tug us from the throbbing crowd. In the skate park you borrow my bike and get a puncture, but it's one of those punctures that fixes itself. Down by the canal, every subculture wants to claim you. We all end up back at some strangers room. Rachel's room in a squat. I've never been in a squat before. All the places that you've played, and all the plays that please the place, and all the saves that save the grace, the great as you have saved, and all the teachers you have taught, and all your thoughts that wrought the right, all the nights to light your light, and all the fun wars you have fought. Queen of anywhere she wants to be queen. She arrives to the party late and leaves early to arrive late somewhere else. This party is anti-everything. There's a guest list, but you're only allowed in if your name's not on it. And the freebase alpha methyl tryptamine goes metallic down our throat. A metal slippery slide throat stuck nice down our throat. Quick slivers of our throat becoming colours up our throat and out of our eyes. The colours are like in the earliest computer games. And even in your knees puking into the toilet, you're beautiful and the colours are still coming. Oh, the test you put things to, and oh, your news that knows no less. Oh, the face all saints love best to bless the doors that you got through, and all the birds of prey you've been, and all the scenes that you have sound, all the sounds that up and down to sing the sounds that you have seen. She makes movies and doesn't bother to film them. We're all in her movie, and this could turn out to be one of those nights where everyone goes home with 50 grand in their pocket. Queen Pirate, Our Lady of the bang the drum, bang the drum, bang the fucking drum for us, make us real. Midwife my imaginary friends and silly stories into being. Just by their name, she always knows which horse is going to win its race. She lives in a warship, she lives in an art installation. The water is simultaneously hot and cold. She lives in a more or less decommissioned power plant. She lives under a bridge. God forgives only those who trespass. She lives in a derelict planetarium. She lives in your house when you're out and you don't even know. Life is fizz, or it's nothing at all. We find a whole new way to make shapes. The drugs always end up getting knocked onto the carpet. Oh, the muddles that you've meddled. Oh, to make our empties full of all the medals that you've muddled. Oh, the medals that you've muddled. Oh, the none. Oh, the muddles that you've won to all the middles that you've meddled. Oh, the Yeah, I think. What was the question?
The role of the audience participation. So.
In any performance where there is an audience, I mean, you just want. It's about energy and intensity. I mean, the movements, the words. It's all the tool to create some kind of mood, some kind of feeling, some kind of passion. And yeah, the more of that, you can do a poetry night and it's good, and people clap, people click, whatever. You do one where you don't get a response. You can do sometimes, it's quite rare, but you can get a real electricity. You can have this stunning mood in the room. You can have like strange intakes or outtakes of breath that like kind of orgasmic moan, like not quite like I haven't had that yet. But, yeah, people collapsing in agony at your, well, perhaps. So I suppose art. Yeah, I do think that art to a large extent is about the reaction. It's about. And like you said, it's not just while it's happening, it's afterwards as well. There are going to be people in the room who could potentially be great friends of yours for life. There could be people who you might collaborate with on huge things. So I'm always aware of that at every audience, that even if I'm doing it and there's like just this dead silence and you can hear people chatting over there. I remember once some people were just playing chess and we talk about it really loudly right in front of the performance area. It's just, what? But then there could be one person, there's something with one person who afterwards will come and say blah, blah, blah. And okay, do you want to come and take LSD in the British Museum with me? It happens, It's poetry and art it's great in itself. But it's also
just to say, Lunar Poetry doesn't condone going to the British Library.
Sorry. Yeah. Sorry.
Sorry, yeah, because I was going to ask you about your. Since we were talking about this, you had a thing a few weeks ago where.
I was going to say, because I used to be categorised as someone that interacted with the audience a lot, purely because I used to walk through the audience. When I first started,
purely, you got people drawing on you,
people writing on me as well, and
it's a whole interactive experience.
But I didn't view that as them interacting with me. I viewed it as me using them as props, which is a slight mental shift. I mean, they are interacting because they're touching you, but when you're sort of walking through the audience, the only interaction that you've got is they're getting out of your way, and it's not quite the same thing. I mean, there's a division, isn't there, between people actually getting up and saying something, heckling or joining in, or touching you. I mean, people can interact with you purely by looking at you. I mean, you can have that moment where you've just looked at someone and you can tell they've got what you said, and that's a pretty strong interaction. And I think you'd have to be, you'd be a liar, I think, if you said that kind of moment meant nothing to you, because I think it's pretty much what everyone's searching for, is to have that moment where you've really connected with someone. But then I started toying with the idea that it might be nice, because I speak Norwegian. I've lived in Norway for 5 years. actually the idea was to do a poem, quite a funny poem, hopefully in Norwegian, have one Norwegian speaker in the audience and have them laughing at the poem and no one else understanding what was going on. And I never got round to writing it, plus like, getting the Norwegian in the audience. And then I thought actually it'd be funny to have two people but have them separate in separate places, so these two people laughing randomly. And I was at a night called Paper Tiger in Kennington a couple of weeks ago, and I did an improvised piece which just started to within 30 seconds just unravelled completely. But I quite enjoy that because there are certain people in the audience that I know quite well and they know it's unravelling, and then you can see them sort of laughing, and it becomes a challenge to finish the set without falling apart in front of people, you know. And I thought, no, this is the time, I'm going to go into Norwegian. So I just started talking Norwegian, and just this guy who was sitting at the back answered. But I wasn't asking any questions, and really weirdly he just kept saying to me over and over, "Are you Norwegian? Are you Norwegian?" So this whole interaction between he and I happened in, actually mine was broken Norwegian, his was broken Danish, but I was trying to explain to him that no, I'm English but I speak Norwegian, could we please chat afterwards? I'm sort of doing something, and he just didn't, like, why he thought I was just standing on stage hoping that someone could speak Norwegian to me. But actually it made the whole thing better, because prior to that people just assumed I was talking gibberish, but once there was a conversation going on, then there's something happening, which is what I wanted to do with the laughter, you see, is where there's a dialogue going on between two people and the rest of the audience are missing out, which actually comes back to another piece that I do, which is based on the one side of a telephone call.
My question about that would be, would you classify that as poetry? And
no, I don't really classify anything that I do as poetry, to be honest with you. But I would go, I don't know, I understand what people mean about spoken word being too open a term, but it's easier for me. Yeah. I mean, I write poetry, but when I'm on stage it's usually looser than that.
For me personally, the word poetry, I can just have a wide enough conception of poetry that what you do is poetry. If someone gets up there and just, I don't know, blows bubbles for 3 minutes,
but that's the thing. If I was to go up and do a 5-minute piece and Tom thought it wasn't poetry and Jason thought it was poetry, that's fine. I don't really care what people think about it, as long as I get to do what I do.
It's the word.
Because the focus was still on language, and it was about how people was responding to that language, then it still has the dynamics of a poem in it.
I mean, I hope that what I say, even when it appears that I'm completely rambling, I hope there are elements that are poetry within what I say, because a lot of what I improvise references stuff that I've written before. You know, things come up from short stories or from poems, and I hope that I write enough so that when I'm actually improvising, that's what's coming out anyway. You know.
For me, writing prose and poetry, the difference is there's a voice. So it's like I said before, that with prose, with stories or essays, whatever, you write it down and it's ink on paper. Whereas something's a poem because it starts going out. It's a sound. It's something that needs to be spoken. So for me, poetry and spoken word, I don't have any. That isn't the same thing to me.
I mean, and the difference is, I think what I'm improvising on stage, if you wrote that down and tried to give it to someone as prose, it would be nonsensical. It wouldn't make and there's no coherence to it. But you could say, well, that's maybe a slightly strange poem, and people will go, I don't like it.
Okay, so one last thing before we get into the final questions, then like we were talking the other night, Jason, you were saying, and I was saying that I thought there were certain similarities between the three of you, and you couldn't really see it. But I think one of the things is that all of your performances have the potential to make the audience uncomfortable. How do you feel about that?
Who wants to go first? Hey, you can make people uncomfortable.
Yeah, I'm really good at it. I don't know. I really like the idea of making people feel uncomfortable, in that it gives you much more leeway to go in different directions afterwards, and then you have that element, and it does sort of like, I mean, I don't want to keep referring to the the same man we keep saying his name, but the comedian.
Yeah.
But not just him, but it's. I think the reason people refer to him so much is because he writes about the theory behind what he does, and I think what he writes about applies to a lot of stand-up comedians. But this idea of most of what I do is a terrible joke. It's the same setup, but the punchline is awful, but it still works and it's got the same arc. But if you start with the audience being uncomfortable, I think it gives you more space to take them on a different, it's going to sound very excellent, but take them on a journey. Come with me. I'm going to be horrible to you. Just come with me, it's going to be awful.
Do I make people uncomfortable in my performance?
You're quite loud.
Yeah, but I bet they can handle it, can't they? Yeah, I mean, there are specific poems I do that, certainly there's some that are very much getting in people's faces and some that are hysterical shrieks of... I don't know. I wouldn't say I'm looking to make people feel uncomfortable. I think that has actually thrown me. I don't really... What do you mean by that?
All right,
apart from being a bit loud at times.
Well, so I mean, your style is I mean, as you're saying, is very energetic. It's very kind of physical, and it's not the norm for most poetry nights, and so I would say that the reactions that people have to you are possibly not the same as, well, I don't know,
I
could be
think,
coloured by that kind of thing.
I think maybe what makes people uncomfortable is they don't know what's coming. Like people seeing you for the first time may think, shit, who let him in? And which is a great thing, I think. I mean, I think that's why, like, the people certainly sitting around this table admire what you do. But I think, people don't, if they come to a poetry night and then you're flailing around and screaming into a microphone, or, but it's the same thing, like Paul and I have talked about this whole idea of being intense performers, and I think it's a really lazy phrase, because it doesn't mean anything, because it allows people to say that I'm intense and you're intense, and somehow that makes us the same, but of course it doesn't, because we don't do the same thing.
No, but intensity doesn't necessarily imply similarity. Yeah, we both have an energy.
Yeah,
that's quite a... But I don't.
But you do the same thing as me. So you cross that boundary. You walk past a microphone. And if you walk past a microphone, people shit themselves. If they're not used to watching you. People are fine because that microphone is a barrier between you and them. And as soon as you walk around it, people don't know what's going on.
I haven't felt that. I felt more curiosity than uncomfort. More kind of... I should have just left that sentence where it was. Yeah, more curiosity than discomfort. Yeah.
Well, I was also thinking about, I think the first time I saw you was when you did the piece with Sean Y. Kyung, the sort of, where you basically end up wrestling with each other. And but you're both doing poems simultaneously.
Yeah,
and
I challenged
sort
him
of
to a
fighting.
poetry duel.
Yeah. And you're sort of fighting for the mic, and it's a very sort of physical piece.
Can I jump in as well? Before, another collaboration me and Stephanie did as well, beforehand we got a member of the audience. We did ask them, we thought about not asking, just grabbing someone and just got them on stage, gagged them, put a gag around the mouth, and just spent 4 minutes pointing water pistols, and they were empty water pistols, and just screaming our poetic manifesto at them. So I suppose that could be quite uncomfortable for some of them. But again, there's more of a kind of WTF kind of thing, what the fuck kind of, rather than an actual... I don't think anyone really...
I think if you... Because I was at the same night at Jaw Dance, and I think what I did maybe put people on the back foot a little bit there as well, because I was down in the audience. But I think if you'd have done that, what you did with Sean, if you'd have been on a smaller stage, it would have been much more intimidating. I think people were able to enjoy what you did because you were removed. You were on a proper stage, which you don't often get with open mic.
No, Rich Mix is amazing.
I don't know.
Yeah, try it somewhere else then. I challenge you to a poetry duel.
Fair enough. Go for it. We might clear the place. I dreamt years ago that enough of me would drain away that I would shrink down small enough to fit into your breast pocket. Only you weren't you then, and that wasn't your pocket. You said that your only regret was you'd never told me how you really felt. You weren't the only one there. I could never find the words to tell you that that was your pocket. It always was my goal, my destination, to be cradled up in your permanently cold fingers, deposited against the warmth of your chest. Home.
I think I'm a lot more. I think I got very much into the French kind of theatre theorist Artaud and his theatre of cruelty, and I did try to kind of implement some of his kind of thinking into poetry. You know, how intense could I make my poetry and the experience of listening to it? How much could I kind of draw out of the audience that would make them feel uncomfortable about being in that room with me? And I don't think I'm that interested in it anymore, actually. I mean, I'm very interested in performers who kind of make that happen, such as yourself, David. But I'm no longer kind of interested in trying to provoke a specific reaction. I'm much more. I think I'm interested in generating a certain intensity in my performance for myself, and then how that relates to the audience, I'm not concerned with. The one thing I would say though is that Artaud always emphasised humour. He said humour was the kind of key to the theatre of cruelty. And I think that's a really kind of interesting idea. And what does humour and intensity bring out apart from vulnerability? And I think for a performer that is the kind of key for me, is when I'm writing my when I'm performing my poetry and when I'm writing it, I have to be somewhat vulnerable for something to work.
I completely agree with you, because I've been striving towards some level of intensity and some provocation of the audience since I started writing and performing, but I've since discovered that the performances go down. There's a much better reaction in terms of me having a connection with the audience if I'm vulnerable in the piece as well.
You just said something about being not concerned with the audience so much, but what primarily do you want from an audience, or do you really just not care?
I'm not looking for a specific thing from the audience. I don't think. I'm not looking for their love or their hate or anything like that. I do like it when they listen. Apart from that, that's the only kind of real criteria. And I want the audience to make up their own minds about what's going on. And that's one problem I have with some poets, is that they want to show themselves through the poem to be a good person, or to be a charitable person, or kind of very kind of neoliberal, kind of almost hipsterish kind of personas. And I think actually that is putting on a kind of mask over the audience, and that's the problem I would have. Yeah. Or even like there's quite a well-known poet who's been kicked out of the Poetry Cafe now, who used to really want to make the audience hate him, and that too is a kind of mask. You know, you're trying to provoke a specific thing to confirm, you know, what you want to believe about
because
yourself.
You become a caricature, don't you? That's the problem.
Sorry, I was just going to say, well, yeah, but you could say that about vulnerability as well. I mean, earlier on when we were talking about humour, you said that's a way of ingratiating yourself with the audience, but so is coming across as vulnerable. You know, please love me, I'm a shy, delicate flower, yeah.
But then I
would like it more to saying, I've done this. This is awful. I thought these things, but I'm just the same as you. I think really, it's not.
It's
Because the
not a
vulnerability is
switch
not a
on
facade, is it?
flicking on.
That's the difference. It shouldn't be. It can be, of course, but I don't think it is as much. The way I think what Tom's talking about is not.
It's not like a switch on clicking on. Now I'm going to be vulnerable.
No, exactly. That's what. Yeah.
I think what it is that.
Or would you say it's more honesty than vulnerability? Is that what you're trying to show? You're trying to be a bit more honest about your character rather than.
Well, it is about being a bit more honest about myself.
Yeah.
And even, my poetry isn't autobiographical, but it's about, those images somehow relating to me, and that connection isn't always that clear to me either. So when I get on the stage and I perform those poems, those little connections start to make more sense to me. And the next time I'll do it, those connections make sense in a slightly different way. So it's like looking at a part of yourself in so many different ways that I somehow either recognize myself more or less, and it's that kind of tension that then opens me up to some kind of vulnerability. My grammar was awful in that sentence.
My poems, I hope, don't say anything about me as a person. I don't want people to know anything like at a factual level about me through my poetry. But I suppose I would like my audiences to be curious about me afterwards, and I'm very aware that I think in the last 4 years, every single kind of social thing that's happened to me ever has been through the poetry scene. It's like it's my entire poetry, my social life. So I think I'm very aware of an audience in that sense, that there are potential friends, potential allies. I want everyone to fall madly in love with me and join my gang, join my cult.
Well, I think that's something we can all agree. The best kinds of audiences are the ones that shut the fuck up when you're reading and then come and tell you how brilliant you are afterwards. That's pretty. They're the best audiences.
It's not enough just to tell you how brilliant you are. Show, don't tell.
All right, so I think we'll have to wrap up now. Two quick questions. What would you say your primary influences are, and do you have any recommendations? Not necessarily poetry, but any recommendations for our listeners?
I think influences is hard because every poem obviously is coming from a different place, especially from the writing. I think I've got some. I noticed that a lot of my poems, the way I sometimes will approach an idea is that I'll sort of engage with another poet. Like when I was reading a lot of Rumi, I was just amazed by it. I thought I was going to write a poem about the experience of reading Rumi and just this kind of real delirious twirl of imagery, and it's kind of simultaneously very religious, but also very kind of knowingly, humorously blasphemous and very playful. And another time I just thought the idea of a poem called David Bowie would just be great, so I just listened to every single David Bowie album and just sort of let them just take me on journeys and just wrote down words. So yeah, and I've done that a lot. I've got poems about Taliesin and who else? And the one I did this year, the opera poem, was just about immersing myself in opera and just trying to, again, filter that through my own sensibilities and just make something from that. So yeah, it's hard to talk about influences overall, but so do you know Alan Moore?
Yeah.
He's an amazing figure throughout my life. He's not primarily a poet. He's done some poetry. He's done some performance pieces. I saw one in the Old Vic tunnels under Waterloo Station. It's this very magical process. Very kind of, he does invocations of gods and spirits and stuff, and he's very sort of simultaneously very serious, very playful, very magical, but very mundane. He's just very committed. He's an amazing person. I think he's a very strong influence in trying to, again, if you listen to his magical performance pieces, they're all about taking maybe an idea or a place. You've got to be into what's it called, psychogeography, and just the amount you can do just by taking a few streets and just like a look at the history of them, the people there, which isn't actually what many of my poems. I've got one of my poems was about, there's a ruined castle in Southend, and I just went there and I heard someone told me it had been haunted. No one ever told me that when I was a kid, but just apparently like 50 years ago when people said it was haunted. So I went there once, took a load of a drug called AMT and just puked a lot and wrote a poem about the ghost rather, which I think engaging with your environment. There's poetry everywhere. Every book you read, you can get a poem from it. Everything you see, everyone you meet, there's poetry everywhere. Who next?
I'm going to go next. I think so one sort of poetry influence is a poem that I read at secondary school. I had a really fantastic English teacher, Mr. Partridge, and he was amazing. And I can remember reading with him a poem called Outside the Gates of Eden by John Cotton, and then in my early 20s I managed to find it, because it's not a very well known poem. I don't think John Cotton was that well known, but it's a fantastic poem, and I actually rip it off a lot without really even thinking about it. But it's just the language in it, and the descriptive language is really cool. But performance style, I've always been really influenced by market traders, and the way they. I think it's a very masculine thing. I think it's a working class masculine thing. I'm obviously, I spent a lot. My childhood was in South London and stuff, and growing up and watching, there's this way that men talk to women when they're trying to buy from their stores, which is really overly. They project more than they need to. They talk over the customers, because they want it's the showmanship of the thing, and that I was always fascinated by, and I didn't really understand it until I became older, and then you sort of realise why people do it, and more recently, a guy called Spalding Gray, who is just absolutely insanely fucking brilliant. Just how someone can be so engaging by but just normally sitting at a desk and reading from papers. It's just fantastic. I can't recommend highly enough that people check him out on YouTube. But I find he's been a big influence, and I'm really influenced by art a lot, mainly painters. It's strange. I don't really like poetry, and I'm heavily involved with poetry. I don't like painting, but my favourite artists are all painters. Three in particular: Leon Kossoff, Francis Bacon, and Frank Auerbach. And to go on to recommendations, Frank Auerbach currently has a small collection of paintings shown in Tate Britain, and next, so in the summer 2015, there'll be a major retrospective of his work. And also, as recommendations, I would say people should get along to like small theatres. I go a lot to the Overall Playhouse in Kennington, and just see. I find it really, really inspiring to watch solo performances, whether it's theatre or dance. Just the way that people interact with the audiences, and to see new ways of. I don't know. There's this mix of you're quite clearly performing for an audience, but there's a barrier there between because the audience aren't involved with the story, and that I find interesting as well. That idea that you are performing, yet there's this invisible barrier. And a book that I've been reading recently is a collection of short stories by BJ Novak, and it's called One More Thing, and they're absolutely hilarious. They're really good, and it's really dark, and just about all of them could be done as like spoken word performance pieces. They're just hilarious. That's it.
Influences. Spalding Gray was. I saw him when I was very, very young.
Oh, did you? Yeah.
And I had no idea who he was. My father took me along to see him, and he was incredible. I don't think I've ever been so enraptured. Like you said, listening to a man sitting behind a desk. And I still kind of remember the actual experience of being there. Other influences, Niall O'Sullivan I would rate as a very high influence on me. Sylvia Plath and a lot of the confessional poets. Although it's more the imagery rather than the confessional aspect that kind of influences me. Some performance artists, Franco B. His last show was absolutely amazing. A lot of it was just him standing there staring at the audience, and you talk about making people uncomfortable, literally just standing there facing the audience for 10 minutes, and the nervousness in the room. And though it's never a kind of performance I would do, but when he did the Blood performance at the Tate, which was his kind of big the one that got his name in all the newspaper. I mean, it's online, you can watch it. I mean, just the intensity of seeing a man walking up and down, all painted white with blood coming from his body, is a kind of mesmerising experience. Although a lot of contemporary poets are influencing me at the moment. Mark Waldron, Bobby Parker, and a lot of American poets like Mattia Harvey and Arena Reigns. Recommendations: read everything if you got enough time, or read Lunar Poetry.
Cheers. Alright, so this has been the Lunar Poetry Podcast. Thanks very much to David, Jason and Tom. See you next month. Cheers.